First and foremost, want to welcome everyone to the webinar. I hope you all have had a great week so far. We've done this webinar before, or similar webinar before, about 3 weeks ago. Some of the information has changed, and even after this webinar, there will be additional information that comes out and things you need to be aware of. Our goal with this particular webinar is to allow you to get some information to kind of get the ball rolling as far as opening back up. I'll give you some things to think about. We're gonna ask that if you have questions that you put those in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the webinar. So if for some reason you don't see the Q&A button, you can put your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to those as well. But again, our attempt to be as concise as possible on this. We're not going to have anyone asking questions throughout the presentation. That's typically how I like to do it, but since there's quite a few of you that are going to be participating on this webinar, we're going to keep the questions to the end. All right. So again, if you cannot see my screen, please let me know. We're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Justin Grooms, and I'm the Senior Risk Control Consultant here at Gaspar Insurance Services. I'm a licensed insurance broker as well as a professional human resources professional. So one of my roles, in addition to insurance, is to consult with companies on a variety of HR issues and safety issues as it pertains to their employees. Obviously, this is a big employee issue right now, trying to get people back to work safely, effectively, and continue to allow your business to function properly. So I know this is a time where people are giving out a lot of information. I'm sure you've all been on webinar after webinar, Zoom call after Zoom call, trying to consume information. So hoping to just add to it, and don't want to make it any foggier than it already is. I'm hoping to give you some clarity on some things and answer your questions at the end. All right. So let's talk about how, if you aren't prepared, what those things can do to your business. Obviously, if you're not prepared when you're opening back up, you're going to see a slowdown in production. You're going to see high levels of absenteeism. If your employees aren't comfortable coming back to work, if they're not assured that you're doing everything in your power to make sure that the work environment is safe for them to come back, you're going to see people just choosing not to come back to work. You're obviously going to have interrupted supply and delivery, whether you're talking about dealing with not only your employees, but also your subcontractors and your vendors. You will start to see civil lawsuits. And again, I don't know if people on this call are business owners or HR professionals, or whatever your role happens to be. If you're a business owner, for sure, you're going to start to see some of these lawsuits. There's going to be attorneys out there. There could be attorneys on the call, but there are going to be a lot of attorneys out there who are going to represent employees and customers who may eventually file civil lawsuits against you for not being prepared when you open your business back up. OSHA. Obviously, we all know that OSHA fines can be levied for you not providing a safe work environment for your employees. So you're going to see some OSHA fines being levied against employers who aren't prepared. Workers' compensation claims, and we'll get into this as we go along throughout the webinar, but most of you know that Governor Newsom passed an executive order that essentially passed the burden of proof onto the employer as it pertains to whether or not a COVID-19 case is compensable through work comp. And again, we'll get into that a little deeper into the webinar. If you're not doing everything correctly as it pertains to your employees and your customers, it can have a negative impact on your company brand and your company name. So these are just a few of the things that you would be looking at if you're not prepared to open your business back up. All right, so how do you reduce the risk of the exposure that we're talking about? And obviously, we're talking about, in this particular case, COVID-19, and how do you reduce the risk? If you're in California, you probably are familiar with something called an injury and illness prevention program. If you're an employer in the state of California and you have 20 or more employees, you are required to have an injury and illness prevention program. If you've never heard of that, you don't know what it is, I would suggest going and do some research on it and seeing if your company falls within those guidelines and those requirements. If you are a company that doesn't have 20 or more employees, but you are a high-risk industry, and OSHA has a list of what high-risk industries are, then you still have to have an injury and illness prevention program. Also, if you're experience mod, and those of you who don't know what an experience modification is, that's a work comp term. And we won't go deep into how you get that, what that is. That's another call for another time. But if you have an experience mod that is above 1.1 or 110, then you have to have an injury and illness prevention program. In addition to the injury and illness prevention program, my suggestion is to develop an infectious disease preparedness program. And a lot of businesses have to have this in place before they can open back up post-COVID-19. And if you need information on this, we're going to have some references at the end of the webinar that you can use, but OSHA.gov and Cal OSHA are both great resources. You got to prepare and implement basic infection prevention measures. Now, you're going to see a lot of information come out. Again, you've probably been drowning in webinars over the past few weeks with information and things you should do and prevention measures. What I'm seeing is the trend is just really going towards basic hygiene and social distancing measures for employers. So at the bare minimum, you need to be implementing basic infection prevention measures. And how do you go about that? Whether it's setting up your office, putting administrative protocols in place, giving that information to your employees, that type of thing. You got to develop policies and procedures for prompt identification and isolation of sick people. If you have somebody that's experiencing symptoms with COVID-19, you got to have policies in place to deal with those people, to get those people isolated or sent home. And those policies need to be expressed to your employees as to what their responsibility is, what's going to happen if they are feeling sick, or how they should handle themselves, or what are the reporting procedures if they do feel sick. So you need to develop those policies and procedures and make sure you're communicating those to your employees. And again, develop and implement and communicate. Communication is the key. You're going to have policies that are flexible, especially when it pertains to sick leave and things of that nature. And we'll get more into that. Implement workplace controls. There are essentially three types of workplace controls. One is an engineering control. Two is an administrative control, and three is a personal protective equipment or PPE, as some people are referring to it right now. So we'll talk about all these, but these are ways that you can reduce the risk of exposure. All right, so what are the components of your injury and illness prevention program? Again, if you haven't heard of this, aren't aware of whether or not your company should have one, or if they do have one currently in place, you need to go to the OSHA website, or we can follow up after this webinar, and I can let you know if you fall into a category where you need an injury and illness prevention program. But rule of thumb, if you're doing business in California and you have 20 more employees, this is something that you need to have implemented. There are essentially 8 parts of the injury and illness prevention program, and these are the 8 parts listed. One is the responsibility. Who's a responsible person? What are the compliance issues? What do you need to have, and what needs to be done? How do you communicate these things to your team, your employees? What are you doing as far as assessing the hazards in your workplace? And then how are you investigating the accident or exposure to those certain hazards? And then what's the corrective action? In addition to the corrective action, you need to implement some type of training and instruction. And then what records are you keeping? So those are essentially the 8 parts of the injury and illness prevention program that have to be present in order for it to technically be an injury and illness prevention program. And again, this is not even specifically pertaining to COVID-19. You need to have this in place anyway, but obviously now, not only OSHA, but you're going to have other entities looking to see if you've got these things in place. All right, so to be effective, it needs to do a few things. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. It's not enough to have an injury and illness prevention program sitting on your shelf with a couple of layers of dust on it. You need to make sure that you fully involve employees and supervisors and management in the creation and implementation of this injury and illness prevention program. One thing I suggest, we work with a lot of restaurants, and one thing I always suggest to restaurant owners or franchisees is that they involve their team in identifying specific hazards in the workplace, especially if you're an owner or if you're a CEO or someone high level in the organization who's not in the office on a day-to-day basis, or who isn't in the restaurant on a day-to-day basis. You might not understand what hazards are present. So it's really important to get your team involved on a ground level and let them help you identify what hazards are in place, and then work together to kind of put prevention or corrective actions in place. It does two things. Obviously, it gives you information that you might not be privy to, but it also gives them accountability in the process. So they feel accountable for things that are happening in the work environment, and they feel a part of it. So that's a good idea to get your team involved in identifying hazards in the workplace. And again, once you identify those hazards, now you got to correct them in appropriate and timely manner. So now, as it pertains to COVID-19, in addition to the injury and illness prevention program, my recommendation is that you have an infectious disease preparedness and response plan. It should consider a few things. All right, plans should consider and address the levels of risk associated with various work sites and job tasks, and the work that's performed at those sites. So what are those things? Where and how might an employee be exposed to COVID-19? These are the considerations you have to think. Where might they be exposed to? Family members, obviously. How far are they traveling? Where are they traveling from? Are they working off-site? You know, we work with some construction companies who are working off-site, working in other buildings with multiple companies. So those are things you need to consider. Do you have employees on your team who have individual risk factors? Are they elderly? Do they have a pre-existing condition? And if so, how are you communicating that to that employee without doing it in a discriminatory fashion? And again, that is really the key. So you can have those open conversations with your employees who might be immunocompromised, who might be pregnant, who might be elderly. Those conversations have to happen so you will know how to deal with those employees, but it can happen in a discriminatory fashion. So the lines of communication have to be so open and so honest that you're allowing those individuals to come to you with their concerns, and then making adjustments according to what they're dealing with that's not discriminatory in nature. You're thinking about considerations like social distancing. Obviously, some offices and business environments aren't set up to be able to social distance, so you might have to implement things like staggered work schedules. You might even have to downsize your operations. A lot of people aren't considering their vendors and independent contractors. When people are coming in and out of your business, how are you dealing with that as it pertains to social distancing? So those are all considerations that you need to be thinking about moving forward. All right, so again, I really think that what's happening right now is we're trending towards these basic prevention measures. And most of us learn this in grade school. We kind of forget it. We kind of go about our day and we forget about these basic things. Obviously, you want to promote frequent and thorough hand washing. Some companies are even implementing additional breaks for people to get up and wash their hands or clean their workspace. And depending on your office environment, this might be something that you want to think about doing. If soap and running water aren't immediately available, in most businesses you're going to have access to a bathroom or access to a sink where you can wash your hands on a regular basis, you need to be providing hand rubs, and these rubs need to be at least 60% alcohol. You're seeing some of these things hit the market that don't meet that criteria, so they're less than 60% alcohol, and based on the CDC recommendations, those aren't appropriate for sanitation purposes. You got to encourage workers to stay home if they're sick. Now, I hear a lot of questions about, whether or not you can have an employee tell you what their symptoms are, and in a pandemic, you can get some of this information. So if normally, you might not be able to get this information, but because this is a pandemic, according to the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, you can ask if they're experiencing COVID-19 symptoms, such as fever, chills, cough, sore throat. If you get that information, you gotta maintain that information, confidentiality of the information, and make sure you keep it in a confidential medical record. So again, typically you don't want to get that information from an employee if they call in and say they're feeling sick, but because this is a pandemic and we're in a unique situation, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing put out guidance that you can ask for symptoms related to COVID-19. You obviously want to encourage respiratory etiquette. People are obviously wearing face masks, and the question often comes up, can I require that my employees wear face masks at the office? And the reality is you can. Now, if you do require that they wear a face mask or some other type of protective equipment, whether it be gloves or whatever, you got to make sure that you're not doing it in a way that compromises an employee's health. So if they have some type of pre-existing condition or some other health situation that doesn't allow them to wear this PPE, then you have to consider that. You got to also provide customers and the public with things like tissues and trash receptacles, also access to a bathroom to wash their hands as well, sanitizers if it's applicable. You want to discourage workers from using other employees' phones, desks, offices, any work tools. My suggestion is to not have things on people's desks, especially if you work in a cubicle setup, things that are movable. So if you have a stapler, there needs to be a place for one stapler in the office. Don't have a bunch of staplers on people's desks where someone can just walk by, pick it up, and use it. So things like that you haven't had to consider before. You typically haven't had to consider loose staplers around the office or loose tape rolls or things like that around the office. But these are the things you need to consider, and you need to make sure that they have their own place and that you're disinfecting those things periodically. All right. Again, maintain regular housekeeping practices. If you have office cleaners, people who come in your office and clean regularly, my suggestion is obviously to beef that up, to have them disinfect more often and more thoroughly. Things that they weren't disinfecting before. Again, the equipment, especially the movable equipment, make sure that's adequately disinfected. You want to make sure you're getting on the Environmental Protection Agency site and seeing what the approved cleaning products are. Again, there are products that have been approved by the EPA to be able to disinfect for COVID. So you want to make sure you have those types of products in your office and you're not cleaning with something that's not effective. All right. I typically want to answer questions right here, but I keep forgetting we're on the webinar. I like these things to be as interactive as possible, but for sake of time, we're gonna keep it moving. All right, so let's get into developing policies and procedures for isolating sick people. You got to make sure you have procedures and policies in place for prompt identification and isolation of someone who's potentially been infected with COVID-19. You should inform and encourage employees to self-monitor at home before they come to the office. If they do suspect that they have come in contact with COVID-19 or they're experiencing symptoms, your policies as it pertains to sick leave and time off need to be very flexible right now. I would love for you all to not, require things like doctor's notes and things of that nature. Again, you can do it if you want to, but my suggestion is that you be as flexible as possible if someone says we're experiencing symptoms of or we've been exposed to COVID-19. You got to also communicate the flexibility of those policies to your employees so that they know that they don't feel undue pressure to come to work if they are experiencing COVID-19 related symptoms. Because you'll get into a situation where an employee is fearful that they won't be given time off if they are feeling sick. So you got to make sure you're communicating the flexibility of those policies to your employees. When you develop those policies for reporting, you want to make sure that those things are, again, not only communicated in a way that is privy to management and supervisors, but that each employee understands it. So that could be through email or however you decide to communicate that. You just need to make sure that they understand what's expected of them and what your responsibility is to them as an employer. You also want to consider isolating people who've come in contact with someone at work who might have symptoms. So for an example, we had a company who had an employee. He went to work about 2 weeks ago. His girlfriend ended up testing positive for COVID-19. He goes to get a test. He tests positive for COVID-19, and he had been in the office. So my first question to the business owner was, did anyone else come in contact with him? Did anyone else come in contact with the office or the area that he was working in? Fortunately for them, he was the only one that had been in the office, so there wasn't any outside exposure. But if that had happened, there would also need to be plans in place for isolating those who were potentially exposed to him. All right. All right, so again, want to encourage you to develop policies that encourage sick employees to stay at home. Talk to companies that provide your businesses with contract or temporary employees. If you have a business where you're getting outside employees, you want to make sure that those procedures that they have in place for their company are just as stringent as the ones that you have. So if you're going through a temp agency or something of that nature, you got to make sure that you're vetting their procedures and their policies as well. Again, back to this requirement of a doctor's note. I'm not saying that you don't need to require a doctor's note for most things, but as it pertains to acute respiratory illnesses, things that could be related to COVID-19, I would suggest you be as flexible as possible on those requirements. All right, so we talked a little bit about workplace controls and the different types of workplace controls. The first type, and probably the most effective type when you're talking about keeping people safe, are engineering controls. And when it pertains to COVID-19, some engineering controls you can put in place are things like installing high-efficiency air filters, increasing ventilation rates in the work environment, whether that be your office or your restaurant or wherever it might be. Installing physical barriers. You see a lot of people are placing plexiglass and physical barriers between people. Evaluate whether you need to rearrange offices, break rooms, and other spaces so that employees can maintain a safe distance from each other at work. A lot of companies are doing this. They're bringing in outside contractors to help them with the office setup. It's very important that you look at your work environment and see what you can do from the engineering perspective. Because in my opinion, this is the most effective. Engineering controls are the most effective. So if you can engineer the hazard out, that's the best way to do it. Specialized portable ventilation might be another thing that you want to consider. Again, these are some examples, not a complete list, but gives you an example of what engineering controls are and what they can be. It might be things like turning multi-user bathrooms into single-use bathrooms by putting a locking mechanism on the outside door. So you see a lot of bathrooms that don't have the locking mechanism. You walk in and there's 3 or 4 stalls. Well, those stalls typically aren't 6 feet apart. So if you got 3 or 4 people in the bathroom at a time, there might not be physical barriers there, especially when you're talking about men's bathrooms and urinals. There might not be adequate space between those urinals to comply with the 6 feet distance. So you might want to look at turning that multi-user facility into a single-use facility simply by putting a locking mechanism on the outside door. All right. So these are things that you might want to think about. So administrative controls. These are just changes in policies and procedures. So if you can't engineer their hazard out, you want to make sure that you're doing everything in your power to put administrative controls in place, educating your employees, developing policies and procedures, putting action plans in place to kind of control it through an administrative way. If you change your workplace policies and procedures, again, you want to think, how are you communicating that to your employees? Do they understand what's expected of them, and what's changed since before we experienced the pandemic to now? What's changed in your policies and procedures? You can't just expect that your employees coming back into the office automatically understand what's changed. And there definitely will be some changes. So you need to make sure you have a method in place for not only communicating that to your employees, but also for making sure that they understand it. right, and that they're on board with it. I talked about this earlier. In addition to regular rest and meal breaks, you might want to provide additional breaks so employees have opportunity to wash their hands throughout the day. If you're going to include these breaks, it needs to be updated in your policies and procedures and distributed to your employees. Developing emergency communication plans. You want to make sure that you're including some type of forum for answering workers' concerns. There are going to be concerns. People are going to want to know what you're doing to keep them safe at work. They're going to have questions about, again, what's expected of them from a reporting standpoint. If they're feeling sick, how do they report that to you? What's the procedure? What's the policy? So you want to make sure you have a place where you can get these questions answered, whether that be an anonymous type of survey where you're getting feedback from your employees. Some people might do it in staff meetings, roundtable discussions. However you decide to do it and whatever works best for your organization is what you need to do. Providing workers with up-to-date education and training on COVID-19. There's so much information out there on COVID-19. You can find it all over the place. You want to make sure that, again, like I said, this information is updated daily, even hourly. So you want to make sure you're always up to date on what's new, what's changing, whether it be on the local level or a federal level. You want to make sure you're up to speed on what's going on. You want to post all the required postings, and then there's some postings that aren't required. They're just good practice to have in your workplace. Definitely, whatever's required of you, you want to make sure you have that posted up. And again, you can go to websites like OSHA.gov, Cal OSHA website, the CDC website, and you can see exactly what it is that you need to have implemented in place based on your local policies. All right, so the last type of workplace control is essentially what we call PPE, or personal protective equipment. When engineering and administrative controls don't work, or maybe they are working, but you want to add an additional level of control on top of them, you use PPE. And PPE is just essentially equipment that protects the employee from whatever particular hazard. Again, in this case, we're talking about COVID-19. So examples of PPE include gloves, goggles, face shields, face masks, respiratory protection, things of that nature. So if you are giving your employees PPE, you need to make sure of a few things. One thing you need to make sure is that they have the proper PPE for them. So that means it fits right. It's not if you're giving someone a face mask, it's the proper face mask. If you're giving them respiratory protection, it's the proper respiratory protection. Most of us don't work in environments where we're going to need anything beyond a basic mask that you can essentially get anywhere. But again, if you're giving it to your employees and requiring them to wear it, you need to make sure that it fits them appropriately. We talked about this before. If someone has a condition that prohibits them from being able to wear PPE comfortably, you want to make sure you're doing everything in your power to accommodate those employees. So you want to consider that. If it's something that needs to be cleaned on a regular basis, you got to make sure you have a procedure in place for cleaning those products. All right. You want to also inspect it, make sure it's not worn or broken or whatever it is. So just some things to consider. And again, we're going to be giving this. I don't know if I told you at the beginning, but we're going to be sending this out to you all so you can have this as a reference. So don't worry about taking too many notes or screenshotting if you don't want to. All right, so we talked about workers' compensation and Governor Newsom's executive order. So a question that we get is, an employee entitled to workers' compensation benefits if he or she tests positive for COVID-19? I'm sure some of you have that question or have had that question, still looking for the answer to that question. It's raised a lot of concerns in the insurance industry for sure. So the long and short of it, I know you don't like to see that answer, but the answer is really yes and no. So Governor Newsom's order, which was signed on May 6th, 2020, said any COVID-19 related illness of an employee is presumed to arise out of and in the course of the employment for the purposes of awarding workers' compensation benefits if certain requirements are satisfied. And we're going to talk on the next page about what those requirements are. And I see your questions. Again, we're gonna answer those at the end of the webinar. This is a very important point to point out that the presumption remains in place for 60 days following the order or until July 5th, 2020. All right. So let's dive into what will be compensable. The employee tested positive for or was diagnosed with COVID-19 within 14 days after the day that they performed work at the place of employment. So again, this is not pertaining to your remote employees, but if you had employees come in and within 14 days after the day that they performed the work, they were diagnosed with COVID-19, the burden of proof shifts to the employer to prove that that case of COVID-19 was not contracted at work. All right. The day referenced in paragraph A above, on which the day on which the employee performed labor or services at the employee's place of employment, it had to be on or after March 19th. So if the work was performed before March 19th, this would not hold true. So the work has to be performed on or after March 19th in order for it to be potentially compensable under Gavin Newsom's executive order. The employee's place of employment, again, was not the employee's home or residence. That means you had them come to your workplace. They were actually in the office or in the work environment within that time period. If they were diagnosed, obviously the diagnosis has to be done by a physician who holds a license in the state of California. So again, the burden of proof has just simply shifted to the employer in these cases to prove that the employee did not contract it at work. All right. I hope that makes sense for all of you. Again, we'll get to the questions at the end, but that's essentially the long and short of it. Can I terminate an employee or refuse to reinstate an employee if they had COVID-19? All right. The answer to that is no. The California Fair Employment and Housing Act prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of physical disability. Even individuals with short-term conditions and COVID-19 may qualify for that protection. Now, if you got questions about this, I'm not an attorney, so if you got questions about this beyond what we discussed, we always suggest you go talk to a labor attorney or someone who's versed on employment law. But as of right now, COVID-19 may qualify for protection under the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. So any adverse action against an employee who has COVID-19, again, would violate the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act. You can go to the Department of Fair Employment and Housing website and get that information. Can I be sued for retaliation for firing or selectively bringing back certain employees? Yes, you can. Again, there's a misperception that employees can selectively retain and fire employees as long as a particular employee is not infected with COVID-19 and not on a related leave. OSHA says that you have to ensure that your workplace is generally safe and free from imminent danger. And if it isn't, then the employee has grounds to say, I'm not coming back to work. So again, I would go to the OSHA website, go to Cal OSHA, make sure you're going through all the proper steps to ensure that your workplace is safe and free from imminent danger. Because if you haven't done all the things that are required of you by law to make your workplace safe, then you've essentially given your employees grounds to not come back to work because they are in fear that they might contract COVID-19. So again, you can't selectively bring employees back, and you've got to make sure that if employees are refusing to come to work, that you don't terminate them until you are assured that you've done everything in your power to make sure that the workplace is safe. All right, and again, beyond what we're talking about here, my suggestion is always to seek legal counsel if you have some issues that we don't get answered on this webinar. So non-diagnostic COVID-19 screenings is essentially our temperature checks. Can I screen employees for COVID-19 symptoms before entering the workplace? Yes. The Center for Disease Control recommends employers measure employees' temperature and assess other COVID-19 symptoms prior to the start of work. Again, a current list of these symptoms are found on the on the CDC website. The temperature threshold currently is 100 degrees 0.4 or higher, and then you can see the list of symptoms that an employee might be experiencing that would warrant you isolating them or sending them home. Really important that you understand, if you are taking temperatures for employees who are non-exempt or hourly employees, that you are compensating them for the time it takes to take their temperature. So if you're requiring them to come 10 minutes early so you can get their temperature taken before they start work, well, if you require them to come 10 minutes early, you've got to pay them for that 10 minutes. You don't want to be caught in a situation where you have a wage and hour claim. So you want to make sure that you're compensating them for whatever time you're requiring them to be there to take their temperature. All right. Another question we got, before I move off this slide, another question that we often get is, should employers require that someone go actually get a COVID-19 test before bringing them back to the office? Now, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission issued some guidance on this. It's super rough guidance, and they haven't really, in my opinion, they haven't fleshed it out too well. But essentially, they say the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission says that you can require them to go get tested. It would not be my suggestion. And again, California is a completely different animal. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is a federal entity, so take that how you will. But even if you do require them to go get tested, again, my suggestion is that you don't. You're going to be on the hook for compensating them for the time it takes to go get the test, possibly to pay for the test as well. So there's a lot of things you want to consider. Again, I would not suggest that you require them to actually go get a physical COVID-19 test, but you can find more information on that on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's website. Do I need to provide my employees with any documents or notices when they return to work? Yes, you do. We already talked about if you change your policies and procedures, you've got to communicate that to your employees in some kind of way, whether that be a physical handout, whether that be an email, or whatever. But if you haven't already, you've got to post things like the Families First Coronavirus Act notice. You got to put that in a break room or somewhere where it's noticeable. If you don't have that, reach out to us. We can help you get that posting. If employees telework, you can email the notice. Businesses in LA County should also post a notice to consumers in a conspicuous place. This is essentially telling your consumers what you're doing and what the risks are. Additionally, while the LA counties, while you're in LA counties, the social distancing protocol requirements, there's essential businesses that had to do things earlier, but now since we're opening back up, we're all going to have to to adhere to these social distancing protocols. It also recommends that you post CDC posters. There's all kind of posters on the CDC site. Stop the spread of germs, basic hand washing, things like that. So these are all recommendations, but my main suggestion is that any policies that you change internally be communicated to your employees. All right, so we're just going to talk a little bit about Gaspar Resources, and then we'll get to the questions. So obviously, we're an insurance provider. We provide things like employment practices and liability insurance, workers' compensation coverages, business owners package, commercial auto coverage. We do special franchise package policies, and then we also do umbrella and excess coverage. So, obviously there's all types of insurance coverages you can have in place to protect you and incubate your business from from things like workers' compensation claims related to COVID-19, employment practices that might be outside of the guidelines of what's required of you. So there's insurance that can incubate you with those things. So we just wanted to make you aware that there were coverages. This is not an insurance webinar, so we're not going to get too deep into those. But I do want to take a look and make sure we've gotten to all the questions before I go any further. So someone asked, how do I handle physical files? Not 100% sure what you mean by that. If you want to type an additional question in there, how do you handle physical files? Not 100% sure what you mean by that. So if you want to go ahead and type an additional question in there, feel free. And if there are, that's really the only question I had. I don't know if you guys had any more questions, anything you wanted to add, if you wanted to type that in the chat. But as of right now, those are all the questions I have. If you see these resources, these general resources are, again, the things that you need to be going to. These are the websites you need to be looking at for all your resources and information. I cannot reiterate enough that things change rapidly and sometimes drastically within a matter of a couple of days. So you want to make sure that you're looking at things like the governor's roadmap to reopening. Again, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has some great guidance from a legal perspective. If you don't understand things as it pertains to employment law, you got to make sure that you're getting counsel, legal counsel. I have a question. If someone goes home sick with symptoms of COVID and we are not supposed to ask for a doctor's note to clear them from COVID-19, how do we know if we need to quarantine other employees? So if someone goes home sick with symptoms of COVID, my suggestion is that you automatically quarantine other employees or employees that they've come into contact with, right? So you don't necessarily need a doctor's note right away. If you think that they've experienced symptoms with COVID-19, my suggestion is to immediately isolate anyone that they've come in contact with. Another thing that I want to point out pertaining to this question is, let's say someone has come into the office, they've gotten diagnosed with COVID-19 or they've experienced symptoms of COVID-19. The immediate reaction would be, once they go home, to go in and disinfect that area that they've been in contact with. Well, the guidance from the CDC says you need to make sure that no one goes into that area for 24 hours. So even if you're going in to disinfect and clean that area, you want to make sure that you don't do that for 24 hours. So that's the guidance from the CDC. And the follow-up was, what if it is just a cold? We always say err on the side of caution, so you can't go wrong if you err on the side of caution. So it could be just a cold, but if you treat it like it's kind of universal precautions, if you're taking any bloodborne pathogen training or anything like that, you treat every piece of blood or saliva or whatever you come in contact with as if it's infected. So my suggestion would be to treat this the same way. If it turns out to be just a cold, great. If it doesn't, you've done everything in your power to keep people from coming in contact with COVID-19. All right, so a follow-up on the question about physical files, a folder that more than one person handles. So I think you're talking about medical files. And my suggestion is that you need to have one person who deals with those files. And also, the medical files need to be kept separate from, and when I say medical files, let's say you're taking someone's temperature. Those files, those results, if you're keeping those, don't need to be kept in the personnel files. Those two files need to be kept separately. Any medical files need to be kept separate from the personnel files. I hope that answers your question. I think that's what you were talking about. But my suggestion is that you have one person dedicated, typically an HR manager, dedicated to managing the files. All right. Doesn't look like I'm seeing any more questions. If anyone has any more questions, let's go ahead and ask away. Otherwise, we'll let you all get to your day. Once again, and I apologize that I didn't mention I was sending these slides out at the beginning of the presentation, but If you all took notes, that's good. It's always better to take your own notes, in my opinion, but I will send these slides out to you. We'll have the resources listed. If you've got questions that didn't get answered or covered on this webinar, there's my email address. So feel free to email me any questions that you might have. We're also recording this webinar. So if last time we recorded, it didn't turn out that great, we didn't get everything recorded. So hopefully this recording is accurate and we have everything recorded. If we do, we will also send a recording out to you. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us. I hope we didn't. Hold up, one more question before I get off. Looks like. Okay, I see your question there, and that last question. If you want to just email me, and we'll talk offline. I want to make sure I'm getting your question answered. And then the last one we have is, what is the best practice with an employee who is coming back from COVID-19 after having tested negative? If they have a negative test, my suggestion is just to treat them like any other employee. They've had a negative test, and there's nothing you need to be alarmed or concerned about. So my suggestion is just to treat them like any other employee. But if that didn't answer your question, I know who you are, see your name, so you can always call me and we can have a discussion about if you have a particular situation that you want to talk about, we can do that. But otherwise, email me, reach out, and we can get your questions answered. So I hope you all have a blessed rest of the day, and we'll talk to you soon.